Thank you, Anna, for having me, and thank you, guys, for staying to the end. And the slides will show that we are close to the end, literally for our Earth. So this is something that I'm very passionate about for many reasons, and we'll talk a little bit about. I didn't get time to put on. I don't really have time in the 12 minutes to talk about the impact of AI, but just so you know. The data centers in the world at the moment utilize 6 times the amount of water that the country of Denmark. So Denmark has a population of 6 million. At the moment, if you look at all the data centers in the world that are powering AI and machine learning and all the rest of it, they're using 6 times the amount of water that a country like Denmark uses. So that in itself, as well as all the materials that are being removed from these data centers, is obviously not environmentally sustainable. But instead of that, I will talk about MRI and a little bit about AI and why that's not really currently sustainable. How many people here actually work with MRI in their, and how many people actually turn off their MRIs completely overnight? So it is a thing, and when I first talked about this 2 years ago at ISMRM, nobody knew that we power off our MRI scanners, our CT scanners, our PET scanners overnight all the time. I'll show you the savings in emissions, as well as cost savings that this does. And there's no reason it takes another 5 minutes to power up the scanner in the morning. But that's obviously well worth it, considering how much you're saving in terms of carbon emissions. We'll talk about some of these strategies and talk about a new project. Well, it's actually not that new now. It's 4 or 5 years old. On using ultra-low field. And these ultra-low field portable scanners, you can literally plug into the wall. You don't need an uninterrupted power supply, unlike these superconducting MRIs, to do an MRI scan. So in the last, and the other speakers may talk about this, obviously there's been considerable emissions over the last 10 to 15 years, and a lot of these emissions actually come from healthcare and come from imaging itself. So we do about 10 million medical exams a year. And obviously, this keeps increasing every year. It's probably more than 10% increase every year. And this contribution, obviously, to global warming, it's probably more than 1.09%, it's probably 1.5%. In Australia, I'll show you in the next slide, is a bit more than that. In fact, it's almost 2 degrees, and we're feeling it. And then the effects of these increase in temperature, so you can see the graph on the top there. In Australia, it's gone up by almost 2 degrees compared to the rest of the world. So for whatever reason, it's a bit worse. And the effects of these on the environment and on health is actually quite dramatic. And people don't realize that it's not just 5 million deaths a year from climate change. And it's not just the indirect effects or the direct effects from rainfall, extreme heat, and fire and so on, but the indirect effects are the ones that are killing the 5 million people, right? So impact on food quality, air quality, and then the health implications. So all these diseases that we're seeing more and more of in terms of respiratory illnesses, mental illnesses, and so on is obviously problematic. And then we'll also see that this is a paper actually that came out of Australia. 9% of the carbon footprint from healthcare comes from, or 9% of the carbon footprint comes from healthcare, and 1% of that comes from imaging by itself. So you can see that if you look at modalities like MRI, which is the worst, 83 times compared to CT scans 17 times, and then ultrasound 17 times, ultrasound times 1. But you can see that it's equivalent to, when you do a scan, it's equivalent to driving a car for 4 kilometers, or driving a car for 145 kilometers in the case of a MRI scan. So clearly producing a lot of carbon. And as I mentioned, radiology contributes considerably to this. And these are some strategies that you must do when you go home, right? Turn your MRI scanner off overnight. Saves 20% of energy because you're not cooling, you're not consuming power. Turn your CT scans off overnight. Again, 53% decrease in energy consumption. Molecular imaging, so things like PET scans, you hear a bit about that in this meeting. Again, potentially considerable power savings when you do this. And another strategy is that we're very keenly involved with at the Alfred is actually reducing low value, or what I call zero value scans. A lot of patients, probably 5 to 10% of scans that we do actually do not alter outcome in patients, and we do it for various reasons, but we can actually cut these scans off and not do them, and that's a big project of ours that has gained some attention from government. So if you are looking at some of these strategies, so we have these electronic CDS, or clinical decision support tools, where we're using evidence-based guidelines to make recommendations as to whether a scan is really needed or not. And if it's not needed, then obviously we don't do it. As I mentioned, a lot of publications now in the radiology literature on how to reduce emissions by switching your MRI off completely, not just leaving it on idle mode, and you can see the equivalence in terms of the carbon savings. And then obviously implementing this for various things can also offset and maintain financial sustainability, not just environmental sustainability. So when you also look at so we just ordered a $20 million Quadra PET scanner that's arriving. Unfortunately, they tell me that it has to be airlifted, air freighted from the US to Melbourne. We are recommending that if you're buying a machine, you ship it instead of airlifting it. Obviously, you know, if you're ordering these machines, we want to have it here as quickly as possible, but if you plan ahead and you don't mind having some lag time, it's obviously much better to ship a scanner to you rather than air freighting it, environmentally more sustainable. So there's all these other supply chain issues that you can consider when you're ordering scans, when you're storing scanners, and when you're producing scanners as well. And these are all in the literature. This is another, you know, MRI is problematic because of the helium. And you'll see that more and more scanners now are helium-free, or certainly the ultra-low field scanners I'm going to show you in a second requires no helium at all, and that's obviously not environmentally sustainable. So I do want to talk about this for a few minutes, and this is another pet project of ours, and you'll see more and more of this now through the through meetings like this, and particularly ISMRM, where people are actually can build a portable MRI scanner in 2 days with some of the techniques that we're seeing. And we go from one end of the spectrum, which is the 64 millitesla hyperfine swoop, which uses very little energy. Literally, you can put it in a van, take it home, plug it in the wall, and scan yourself. And Karen and Juan over there are some of our collaborators on this project. Karen's going to try and use it for traumatic brain injury and IPV patients that have domestic violence, so we can actually also provide accessibility to these scanners in areas which are remote, that don't have access to these scanners. So you can see this is a menu of the low field scans, ultra low field scans, and then the FreeMax, which is a 0.55 Tesla scan that's helium free. And what does this mean then? Well, you can see the comparison between the swoop, which is the 64 millitesla, consuming 0.6 kVA versus a 1.5 Tesla, 50 times that or more, and a 3T, another 2 or 3 times on top of that. So the carbon footprint is clearly more as we're using these superconducting magnets. And you know, do we need to? So what in one field in our neuroimaging sphere, we are considering going to higher and higher field 7T. But my feeling is that it's actually going to go in the other direction, and we're going to scan at lower and lower field, partly because of this environmental sustainability, but also because of the AI that we're using. And this is a project that is a multi-center project that's supported by the National Imaging Facility, and it involves 5 of these ultra-low field MRIs in the 4 or 5 states, in WA, in Perth, in Melbourne, here in Queensland, there's one of these. And we've been trying to obtain scans for various projects, but essentially we're collecting scans from these 5 sites around Australia, and we obtain a paired low field and a high field scan, and we've developed an AI to actually produce a 3T scan from these low field scans. So we actually don't need to consume energy by generating a 3T image anymore. And there's a few large projects that are utilizing this infrastructure. So one of them is Connect TBI, or Pioneers TBI, where we're collecting data from 5 cities, from about 15,000 brain injured patients, and then storing them at Monash and using the AI to actually develop some agentic AI and foundational models, which I'll talk about in a second. Interestingly, when we do this, obviously there is use of data centers that requires energy, but the plan is to collect these data, store it, and then develop some agentic AI, which will hopefully help us improve our diagnosis. Just to give you an example of what the images look like. So on the top, are these ultra-low field scans, very blurry, and on the bottom of the 3T scans, right? But we can still see the pathology in these scans, and you can see that in the synth 3T are the synthetic images, so these are generated images from the AI that we've developed from the paired 3T and ultra-low field. And you can see that the synthetic AI images are almost identical to the 3T images, but only using a fraction of the energy to produce the ultra-low field scans. And then you can see that again, the pathology is this patient's had a stroke on the right insula, and you can see the images both on the bottom row, which is the high field, and then the top row, which is the blurry ultra-low field, where you can also see the pathology. Right. So the opportunities for us to not only make these generated AI images, but importantly also make a diagnosis where we know that the lesion or the abnormality is seen on the 3T, but not seen on the low field scan. It doesn't matter anymore that we can't see the abnormality. In fact, foundation models and agentic AI will actually remove the need for a human to be able to see the abnormality. And I can say that because I'll probably retire soon. So you actually won't be needing to generate these images anymore for a human to see them, because if we can develop an AI, and here's an example of a patient with MS, that we can see it on 3T, we can probably see it on the 64 millitesla, but some of the lesions we can only see on the high field scans and on the synthetic scans, right? So, and eventually what we aim to do is actually train the AI to make the diagnosis, generate a report, and not even requiring a human to be able to see the images. And then eventually we can put one of these scanners in a van, take it out to remote areas in Australia where there's no access to MRI scans, and obviously we can also provide the MRI scans with very low energy consumption. It's environmentally sustainable. And then lastly, this whole concept of, I already talked about this, we are experimenting with, and I think with Karen's project, hopefully detecting patients that have brain injury that we can't actually see where the abnormalities are, like microhemorrhages. And in fact, some people, and this is actually from ISMRM 1 or 2 years ago now, where people are actually using the case-based data to make disease classification. In other words, make a diagnosis and provide a radiology report without actually generating the image. So this is disease classification on case-based data. So people get asking, why do we need to generate the image? Well, we probably don't. And we're kind of doing a little bit of this ourselves by generating these images synthetically and making the diagnosis. So I'm going to finish there, but kind of very quick overview of how we can be more environmentally conscious with our imaging. Please go home and tell your MRI supervisors to turn the scanners off at nighttime if you're not already doing it. And some of those other strategies that I mentioned in the slides, I didn't put the paper up, but we actually just submitted a paper with ISMRM and the Society for Cardiovascular MRI on some of these strategies. So hopefully that paper will be out soon to summarize how we can be more environmentally sustainable. Thank you very much for your attention.
Go home and tell the scanner supervisor to turn off the scanner, because it will make also our facility management happy, because they're concerned about the energy bill. Before we take questions from the audience, there is one popping up in the app, and it is there any concern for AI hallucinations in the generative 3D images?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, Karen organized an educational session on Tuesday, and we talked about this. So at the moment, because this is a diffusion type generated pix-to-pix strategy, we're not seeing hallucinations with this approach to Gen AI. We will plan on using large language models in the next iteration, probably. And with that, there is concern that there may be some hallucinations, but hopefully we'll have strategies in place that will reduce that. But that is an important concern, yeah.
Is there any other questions emerging in the audience? Yeah, go for it. Yeah, if you're allowed to.
is really because of, changing, our
Yep.
habits here, and how much should be geared towards, like, changing other things ultimately?
Yeah, that's a good question. I took some slides out that I would normally talk about. Countries where which are using more sustainable and energy sources. Australia's actually not bad. Australia and some European countries, and Germany in particular, are very good at using more sustainable energy sources. We still use a lot of coal here in Australia, so that in itself, probably particularly brown and black coal, is not that good because these superconducting MRIs are obviously using a lot of energy. So that in itself is a strategy that if the states like South Australia are actually very good at using wind and other renewable energy sources, but states like Victoria and Queensland's not bad, not so good. So the other component that you speak about is the helium factor, and there is a shortage of helium, and we have to kind of recycle it and produce it. That in itself is obviously not environmentally sustainable. But the scanners you will see now, the next generation of scanners will be helium-free, and then I think we will move to these lower field scanners where there actually won't be any need for helium anymore. So that I feel will be less of a problem. But thanks for your question.
Thank you. Thanks, Meng.
Thanks.